Well, I want to thank you for the opportunity to be here today to talk about cooperatives and housing cooperatives in general. I could talk about co-ops all day long, so I have a timer set for 35 minutes, and we'll see how much we get accomplished in that length of time. So I want to tell you a little bit about myself, about my organization, and then kind of the big picture of cooperatives, and then housing cooperatives specifically. So I've been at the Indiana Cooperative Development Center for 18 years in October. Prior to that, I was involved in the Small Business Development Center program for about 8 years here in Indiana, and then a number of other states around the country. So I've been in community and economic development all my career. From working with individual entrepreneurs to working with groups of people who are wanting to start businesses that are formed as cooperatives. So ICDC was established in 2006 as a nonprofit nonprofit organization. The majority of our funding comes from USDA Rural Development, which puts some strings along with the money that they give us. Most of my work occurs in rural communities, but I can step outside of that as I have other sources of money to help me do some work in urban spaces. We typically work in these categories that you see here. There's been a huge push, a lot of interest in housing and childcare, so we've really tried to do some programming around both of those areas. Employee ownership is another really up and coming type of organization where businesses who are looking at transitioning, the owners are looking at transitioning and getting out of their business. How do they retire? And if their kids don't want it, there's not a ready buyer, then perhaps they sell it to their employees as a worker cooperative. The work that we do is in 3 buckets. So the first one is technical assistance or one-on-one consulting. So if anybody had an interest in starting a co-op, you could call me and we could work with you one-on-one to start the business. The other, where we put a lot of our time, is in education, whether that's in webinars or workshops or conferences. It helps us really spread ourselves much farther than we could strictly working one-on-one with people. And the final bucket is advocacy, trying to educate our elected officials about the co-op business model. We don't lobby, because that's not allowed, but we do try to educate as much as possible. Let me go back. So who knows what a co-op is before I put that up? Shout it out.
Employee-owned business.
That's one type of co-op.
Shout out examples.
You can shout out an example, sure.
I'll say food co-op.
Yep. Anybody else? Do you bank at a credit union, anybody?
Yeah.
That's co-op. Sometimes it's hard to find that they're a co-op. They don't always tell you up front, but they definitely are a co-op. So co-ops, and this is a big, long definition that I won't read to you. The International Cooperative Alliance has this big, fancy definition for a co-op, but essentially, it's a business that's owned and governed by its members. It's just that simple. And that type of business can be in any industry that you can imagine, any place in the world. And as Nate mentioned when he was in Latin America, co-ops were a model that was used a lot. And there are a lot of co-ops here in the States. There's about 78,000. But that's a drop in the bucket to the possibility and the opportunity to start a cooperative. Any industry that you can imagine, any place on the planet, you can create a co-op. I like to say that creating a co-op is only defined by your imagination. So whatever idea you come up with, that idea can be encapsulated and created as a co-op. I'm going to put all these up here. So there are 3 areas. I'm sorry.
Just a question. Is
Sure.
it also a legal business structure?
So there is a legal business structure, and the state of Indiana has several statutes that are specific to industry, like there's ag co-ops, rural electrics, telephones, credit unions, and then there's one that's called a nonprofit mutual benefit corporation, that if you wanted to start a food co-op, that's the statute that you would organize under. So that's from a legal standpoint, but you can also just a bunch of people get together and decide that they're going to do X, Y, or Z and cooperate, but not in a legal structure. So there are three areas in a business that differentiate a co-op from any other type of business. One is in ownership. So when you become a member of a co-op, you are making a financial investment in that business. So you're an owner. Even if it's just you're one of 5,000 people, you're still an owner. Control. In a cooperative, the control rests with the members. So the only reason the co-op exists is to meet the needs of the members. And if the co-op is not meeting those needs, there are ways for the members to either take corrective action or it could dissolve the cooperative. Again, the co-op exists for the members to their benefit. I should have mentioned here under control, the members elect the board of directors from amongst the people who are members. So outside people are not going to come in and tell the co-op how to do its business or how to run itself. So it's the people who are members who can serve on the board. And when the members vote on issues that come before the membership, one member, one vote. So if you own stock in a corporation, if you've got 50,000 shares of stock, you may have quite a bit of influence. If you have one share of stock, you basically have no voice at all. But in a co-op, it doesn't matter. Everybody is equal. And there are some scenarios where the bigger ag co-ops, it's a little different. But for the most part, it's one member, one vote, irregardless of how much money that you put into the co-op. So it really is an egalitarian, equality type of organization. And another unique thing about cooperatives that you can't say about any other type of business structure is that there are a set of 7 principles and a whole bunch of values that all cooperatives follow, whether you're an ag co-op, a farming co-op, a housing co-op, a food co-op. Doesn't matter the type of co-op, doesn't matter if you're here or in Cuba, who actually do have some cooperatives, Latin America, Europe, Asia. All co-ops follow these values and principles, which I think is a really cool kind of way to talk about a business. What other business do you know of where no matter the industry or where you are, that you all follow the same set of principles and values? I'm not going to go through them. You guys can read. I kind of mentioned this earlier, the difference between the cooperative and investor ownership. Inside, in a cooperative, the relationship between the members and the cooperative is one-on-one. I mean, there's nobody in the middle. In a corporation, ownership, there's lots of layers in between you and the corporation itself. So your voice gets diluted in the corporation as opposed to being part of a co-op. Co-ops didn't just pop up now. They've been around for a very, very long time. In fact, the very first cooperative, it's not on this chart, this is mainly about housing. The first cooperative was created by Benjamin Franklin, and it was an insurance company. And it's still in existence today. It was created in Philadelphia. So it's a very old business model. And even before that formalized structure, human beings have been cooperating since we set foot on this planet. I mean, you know, when we were in that hunter-gatherer kind of stage, working together, it was so much easier to keep yourself fed, clothed, and all those kinds of things than it was to try to do it on your own. So cooperation is kind of inherent to the human DNA, but sometimes we forget that and we get too wrapped up in ourselves and me. I came out of the me generation, so it was all about me. But co-ops are all about community, working together. So the first housing co-op recorded was in 1857 in New York, which is not surprising. housing in New York has always been expensive. It wasn't any different then. Then the first, and that was for artists, the first really truly all-encompassing housing co-op was in the early teens. And then post-war, First World War, there were a lot of housing cooperatives coming on the scene, and in the 30s you also started seeing student housing cooperatives. Does Ball State have any student housing cooperatives?
I don't think so.
Okay, okay.
I don't know if one in Bloomington.
And then Purdue has quite a number. Yeah, yeah. So it's a unique model that teaches students a lot more than just living together, but I don't want to get off track here. And then in the 50s, right after the wars, we saw a spurt in housing cooperatives. And in the 70s and 80s, we also started seeing a lot more cooperatives come about, partly because there was some government funding through HUD that became available. So trying to look at what's the difference between a housing co-op and other types of housing. So on one side, let's look at, say, a condominium. Each person owns their individual unit, right? And they own a divided piece of the property. And on the other end, you have renters who don't own anything. Somebody else owns that building. And somewhere in the middle is a housing co-op where all the members own an undivided share of the property. And as we talk about the different types of co-ops, housing co-ops, that gets a little muddy, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. So looking at these particular elements of cooperative ownership, we're going to look at each one of them in a little bit more depth: the structure, democratic governance, operation at cost, and then the subordination of investment value to use value. And if you have questions as I'm talking, feel free to ask. So in the corporate structure, typically the cooperative, and a lot of times they're nonprofits, organized as nonprofits, they own the whole. And then if they're an ownership, an equity model, then the individual members own the right to a unit inside of that building. There's membership as well, just like with any other cooperative. You're a member of that cooperative. You have the right to run for the board, to hold that board accountable, and then there are some leasehold rights of occupancy for member owners. And here again, democratic governance is kind of the underpinning. It's one of the 7 cooperative principles. Holds true in housing cooperatives as well. Again, members have the right to be represented on the board, to run for the board if they so choose. And members also, just like in a corporation, big issues will come before the membership to vote on. The same thing happens in a housing cooperative. This is a little unique, operating at cost. So the co-op has to have a black bottom line, right, in order to stay in business. However, the goal is not profit. That's not the driving motivation for a cooperative. I don't care what kind of co-op it is. It's no different in a housing co-op. So the board will prepare an annual budget. It takes into account, operations, debt service, property taxes, all those kinds of things. And then each member is going to pay a proportionate share of the annual cost in the form of monthly carrying charges.
So they don't have to pay property taxes though because they're a nonprofit?
It depends on the type of co-op that it is. So there are some models that we're going to talk about where property taxes do come into play. There was, in Marion County, there was it's been several years ago, a big effort to exclude cooperatives from property taxes. I think they were successful in that. And then profits in a co-op are not paid to some outside investor because most co-ops do not take money from outsiders. So the money that they raise is either through debt or through member loans, so that there's not somebody out there calling the shots, pulling the strings. It's the members who make those decisions for the cooperative. And then the savings, the net income that comes after you close your books, say you've got $1,000 in profit, part of that money will stay as retained earnings to make sure that the business continues and is able to operate. And part of that, the board could decide to return to the members as patronage dividends. And that is just as simple as the way it sounds. The more business, not necessarily with a housing co-op, but say in a food co-op, the more business you do with the food co-op, the more you purchase from the food co-op. If the board decides to do patronage dividends, then the bigger your patronage dividend is going to be, because it's based on how much business you do with the co-op. Same thing in an ag co-op. We're going to look at the types of buildings, resident demographics, the way that housing co-ops can balance affordability with wealth creation, and some of that plays into the type of housing co-op, and then the various variations in ownership form itself. So housing co-ops can look like anything you can imagine. It can be a high-rise, just like a big apartment complex that you see in a city. It can be townhouses, it can be garden apartments, it can be student housing, it can be mobile home parks or manufactured housing parks, detached single-family homes, lofts, runs the gamut. So I pulled some photos for you to see. The one in this one, South Bend, it is a scattered site housing cooperative. So the co-op bought lots in a particular neighborhood, bought multiple lots, and each of those lots belongs to the housing co-op, and they are single-family homes with attached garages. It's a really cool concept. I've not seen it duplicated in Indiana since. The Rockford, Maine, that is a manufactured, yes?
Just maybe everybody, this is clear, just a clarification. Thinking about explaining the cooperatives again, like that example, like you might have an investor comes to Muncie and says, I'm going to buy 50 lots, I'm going to create affordable houses, and then I'm going to rent them out to tenants, or I'm even going to sell them to folks. In that model, the investors are the people that are actually owning the house. And so then decisions made about that conglomerate of houses are made by the people that
Right.
live in the houses.
Yep.
Sorry.
Yep. And this one, I don't want to get into this too deep because I'm not very versed in it, but this particular project used tax credits to finance the project. That's really difficult to do. But if anybody knows Ann Mannix out of South Bend, she's a developer up there. She is pretty determined. She pulled it off. Okay, so we've got the manufactured housing, the one in Eden Prairie. As you can see, it's about 4 stories, pretty big complex. This one in Indianapolis is an affordable housing complex, Mayfield Green on the near west side of Indianapolis. It's about 300 plus units, and they run at about 99% occupancy. So it's a really popular place to live. The Eden Prairie project is a senior housing project, and again, the Minnesota project there is a senior housing, as is Mankato. But I wanted you to just see the different structures to know that housing co-ops can look like anything you want them to look like. They can fit into the community in which you're building them. The Bloomington, Minnesota is again another senior housing cooperative. There's a student housing project there at Purdue. So again, just photos of the possibilities, and you can see the one in New York is a really big high-rise. And if you had to pay rent in New York City, you'd know why they have quite a few housing cooperatives. This is another picture of Indianapolis. It's an affordable housing complex. I think it's Three Rivers, or Three Fountains East, affordable housing. Most of what we have in Indiana is affordable housing cooperatives. They were created when HUD was flush with money about 50 years ago to create affordable housing. Most of them have paid off all that debt, and now they are in kind of maintenance mode, and gradually add on to build amenities into the housing cooperative.
We have one of those that probably was in that cohort here.
Okay.
In Delaware County.
There are a few market rate and then the scattered site, but most of what we have are affordable housing. And so a cooperative can create a community of choice, like a senior housing cooperative, which is specifically for seniors. The student housing cooperative, specifically for students. That housing cooperative, which was the first housing co-op that was built for artists, again, for a specific type of population. It can either be around, like, I don't want to say age because that gets them in trouble, but it could be around a shared value, a shared need. So there's lots of opportunity. There's some projects in Canada that are kind of mixed use. So there's some units that are for affordability. There's some that are kind of market rate, and they have some units that are for individuals with disabilities. So it's really trying to duplicate what the community outside of the housing co-op looks like. And living in a housing co-op creates community, right? Because you are living in this building with lots of other people. So it does create a sense of community, whereas if you're living in a subdivision, lots of people don't even know their neighbors. So this gives you an opportunity to really get to know people who are living in that housing co-op with you. Also creates economy of scale, because if you've got 330 units, and so you do over time replace the carpet or replace the appliances. So you're buying in quantity so that you're able to get those economies of scale. So here's some models, some cooperative housing models. Some focus on affordability and some are focusing more on wealth creation. So the market rate cooperatives are exactly the way they sound. They are, the cost of those are whatever the market will bear. And a lot of the senior housing cooperatives that you saw that are in Minnesota and the Twin Cities area are market rate. So as seniors decide, I'm tired of shoveling snow, or I'm tired of cutting my grass, I'm tired of upkeep, I want to go someplace where I still have control, and it's similar to, they sell their house, they buy the right to live in one of those units. And so when they die or leave, then when that property comes back on the market, usually has to go back through the cooperative. It's at whatever the market rate is, okay? So there's the ability to create wealth by living in a market rate cooperative. Limited equity cooperatives are very similar, except that there is a clause in that contract that says over time that cooperative is only going to appreciate X percentage. So maybe it's 1%, 2%, 3%, whatever the organizers decide makes sense. So there's an element of wealth creation, but there's also an element of affordability to make sure that people coming in after those residents leave, that there's more ability for them to move into that unit. The group equity or the mutual housing associations, that's most of what Indiana has, because it's very similar to living in an apartment except that you're a member of the co-op, you can serve on the board, you can serve on committees, and you have a say in how the cooperative is organized, how it's run and operated. Manufactured housing. If you know anyone who lives in a manufactured home, you know that they don't own the land that their home sits on. So they are subject to the owner coming in at any point and saying, hey, you're out of here because I just sold the property to a developer and I'm going to make a lot of money. So by converting, when the owner is ready to sell, if the residents can come together and find a way to finance that and turn it into a cooperative, then they now control the ability to keep their home there, keep the rents at a moderate rate so that there's not any, nobody's jacking up the price on them. The problem with those conversions is, and Indiana is pretty high up on the list, is that big equity investors have come in and bought up these manufactured housing communities. So when they go to flip them, they want to get their money back plus a profit. So it's almost impossible for the residents to raise the money that would be required to purchase that. And I believe it's New Hampshire created a law several years ago which gave the residents the right of first refusal. So if the owner decides they're going to sell, then the owners, people who live there, the residents, have the right to purchase it before it goes out on the market. I would love to say we had something like that here in Indiana, but we do not. Yes?
I don't know if this is relevant to all the different 6 models that we just talked through, but thinking about maybe Muncie's not as relevant right now because we're not having a problem with thousands of people coming to live here and pushing other people out.
Mm-hmm.
When you think about investment in like affordable housing, and that you want to like have, you know, some years,
Maintaining that
longevity.
affordability? Yeah.
Yeah, having a cooperative or something like that that guarantees that it stays affordable is a way to make that investment continue to be in affordable housing and not just any old housing in a place like New York City, where you make an investment in affordable housing if there's no mechanisms that maintain it as affordable housing in 10 years. That would be sold as market rate, and then it's not an investment in affordable housing.
Right.
So it's just one of those things that can make much more exponentially and have longevity.
Absolutely.
If your goal is affordable housing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And there, Mayfield Green, one of the affordable housing complexes in Indy that I mentioned, they were approached a number of years ago about selling to an outsider. And it took a lot of conversation on the part of the board chair and others on the board talking to the members of that cooperative to not do that. Because if you are living in an affordable housing community, there's a reason that you're there, right? Your income doesn't allow you a lot of luxuries, right? So someone comes in and offers you on the front end, say $10,000. That could sound like a lot of money. But when you think a little bit longer term, it really isn't. Because where are you going to go outside of that building that you're currently in? How long is that $10,000 really going to last you? They were able to convince the members to not demutualize, which is what the process is called, and it's still a housing co-op. But that can happen if you've got somebody who wants that piece of property, knows that it could be a huge moneymaker for them, and they come in and they flash all kinds of money at people. It has happened.
I do have a question. So what you're saying is an investor wanted to come in, he wanted to buy all the property through the entire cooperative, and then you'd have
Yeah,
for
it-
renting.
yeah, they call
They
them,
don't own that somebody else owns the land. Do they take care of the land? Does the
Yeah,
cooperative
so
maintain
the-
the land? You
yes.
talk about somebody doesn't want to mow their grass anymore.
Yep.
So that kind of sounds like a community land trust that we had
Mm-mm.
maybe a couple times back.
it isn't.
Yeah, but if somebody wanted to, could they just go ahead and deal with that investor and then it could take out, or it cannot? It has to be all voted on?
It would be voted on, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you have to go by the vote.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
they have bylaws,
Yeah,
and so there are
so
requirements for,
you're basically, because anybody who struggles is always, worried about somebody doing something. So,
But
I don't know, I
but
mean,
instead of like, if that building that all those folks were living in was.
well, I was talking about individual houses.
Bought by an investor,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah, I mean,
The investor would be able to make that decision himself,
yeah.
rather than with.
But then all of those people would have to find someplace else to live.
yeah,
They would all have to find someplace else to live, and that defeats the whole purpose.
right.
Aren't we trying to help people get established in a neighborhood around people with maybe mutual interests or whatever, but you can be scattered. It doesn't
Sure.
have to be a big clump, and it can be vacant lots. Did I hear you say at the end? It could be also just vacant lots.
Well,
Lots.
the South Bend co-op, I don't know that they've developed all of those lots. So it happens
But I
over
mean,
time.
There's beauty in a green space,
Oh, sure,
so
yeah.
I'm saying,
Yeah.
because I'm kind of liking the green space.
Well, and if
Yeah,
you,
to me, that sounds, I mean, maybe people will just live there temporarily, and maybe they'll get a better job, or their situation will be better, and they'll move out, somebody else can move in.
yeah,
So, but I think that would still be kind of, I don't know, what am I trying to say, Nate? A little bit,
I think,
unsettling,
you have to be expert.
yeah.
so I'll give you an example. The woman who is the board chair for Mayfield Green started working at Mayfield Green when she was a teenager with a summer work program. When she got older, had a family of her own, she moved in there. She raised all 3 of her children in there. So she's lived there almost her entire life. Probably, I'm trying to think how old Frankie is, 30 or 40 years. So some people move into these, even to affordable housing cooperatives, and they stay there.
And they do want to stay, just
Yeah.
like I'm back in the home place, actually the second home place, the first one was
Yeah.
torn down, a block and a half away. So, no, I like my neighborhood, I love my neighborhood, but it's not the same. But yeah, so I'm staying there for the duration, so once you're used to a community, yeah, good or bad.
Yeah, and there could be lots of turnover, but housing cooperatives, there's an extra layer of insulation, if you will,
Right,
because you have the ability you have some control. It's not like living in an apartment complex where
Right.
you're at the mercy of the landlord. He can raise your rent at any point.
right.
In a co-op, an affordable housing cooperative, the board is going to come together and look at, are our expenses going up? Do we need to raise those monthly carrying charges? That they're not going to just raise monthly carrying charges because they can. Yeah, yeah. And you were talking about green space. If you look at these, you can see they're not just concrete jungles, right? So there's,
But when you look at that, the bottom ones, you don't see many trees.
that's true,
And I
that's
tell
also
people,
in
I'm thankful
Minnesota.
for my trees, that gives me shade, so not everybody doesn't have trees, and it's amazing, some of these, developments, there's no trees.
You spoke about raising the rent, but there are still some of those factors that still apply when it comes to, of course you have to follow things like the bylaws and all of these things. But when you look at raising the rent, even in the co-op space, you still have to look at things like fair market value, to determine a reasoning for increasing those rent
Yes, I mean, they don't just arbitrarily raise them because they can.
That's what you were saying.
Yeah.
But things like fair market value, at the rate that we are currently going, they're escalating fast.
No, I don't think that plays into
Okay.
these affordable housing cooperatives. First of all, they have to follow the guidelines for
Correct.
affordability.
Correct.
And so that plays into it as well. And the people who are on the board, they live there, right? So they're not going to be raising the rent just because they can, because it's going to affect them as well. So I would push back on looking at outside forces. It could be that maintenance has increased, or they need to do some really wholesale remodeling or something like that, and that could cause the rent to go up. But it's not one of these where, I know when I lived in apartments when I was going to school, every year you'd get some kind of rent increase. That's not the way these work.
So that's where you mean you got the insulation. People aren't going to
Yeah.
come in. That's where the insulation is.
Right, and I love the added component of the residents also live there because not only are they advocating for themselves, but for the entire community. So that is a beautiful added component as a protective safety net,
Mm-hmm.
to kind of keep things at a minimum.
So I like to also kind of liken this to, you are an individual who lives in a unit in a housing cooperative. But when you go to a board meeting, take that hat off as an individual. Now you're putting on the hat that belongs to the whole co-op. So you're making decisions that are in the best interest of the cooperative as a whole, not you personally. And that sometimes takes people a while to get that. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of the drawbacks to being in a co-op. Have we got a few more minutes? Okay. What time is it? Oh, okay. I'll go through these pretty quickly. Let me get them all out here. So there are benefits, obviously, to individuals that we've talked about. Affordability, where the co-op operates at cost. All the different kinds of housing models that we saw, whether they're high-rises, 1 or 2 stories, manufactured housing. In the market rate and the limited equity models, those are ownership models. So there is equity being built up, and there are some tax advantages when it comes to property taxes and things like that, that it's just like living in a house that you have in this cooperative. When you think about, as an individual, how many times in our lives do we get the opportunity to be part owner of a business, right? Not often. So if you are living in a housing cooperative and are serving on a board, well, as you're living there, you're part owner. But being on that board teaches you skills that perhaps you would not have learned if you had not been in the co-op and not served on that board. So there's some individual skill building that happens there as well. And confidence. I mean, people sitting around a table, if it's the first time you've ever served on a board, it can be kind of scary. I know the first time if I'm serving on a board and maybe it's my first meeting, I tend to sit back and kind of get the lay of the land before I say anything. But it really does help build individual skills. There are obviously social benefits as well. Again, the cooperative is self-managed. For bigger complexes, they will have an outside management company that assists the board, but the board is still making the decisions about the operation of the cooperative. This management company is just assisting. Leadership development, again, and in housing cooperatives, you'll see lower rates of delinquency and default than you would in just a regular housing market. People really see living in a co-op as an advantage, right? And most of these, especially in the senior housing cooperatives, there are very long waiting lists to get a unit in those housing cooperatives. I mean, it could be 10, 15 years. So there are some distinct advantages from a social perspective. Community as well. Housing cooperatives can be an engine for economic growth. They can also help stabilize neighborhoods that are maybe transitional. If you put a housing cooperative in there, you got people living there, then other services, wraparound kinds of services, maybe it's grocery or drugstores or whatever it happens to be, are kind of drawn to the community as more people move in. Cooperatives can also stabilize out-migration. So especially on the senior side, if you have a senior housing cooperative, then people who are elderly, people who are living in that community now have a place to go when they decide they don't want to live on their own anymore. So it maintains the wealth of that individual in the community and helps keep them there, as opposed to letting that talent, those folks, move out of the community. And again, engagement of individuals who live in a community. So it's not all roses, especially in affordable housing cooperatives. If you are used to, all of your life, you've lived in an apartment, and now you're in a housing cooperative, it's sometimes hard for people to switch that tenant mindset to where I just go with the flow, I don't have to worry about any decision making, the landlord's going to take care of that. Well, now, living in a housing cooperative, you have the opportunity, and I would say obligation, to be involved in the housing co-op. And sometimes people can't make that transition. Some people just want to live in a single family home. They don't want to live in a housing cooperative and have a neighbor on each side of them and above them and below them. Sole ownership, again, in the ownership models, the market rate and the limited equity, there are some restrictions on resale. Like the co-op has to be part of that resale when the member leaves or passes or however that happens. Group decision making. Co-ops are about group decisions, not individual decisions. And it's just like our democracy in this country, it's messy. It takes time. You don't make a decision overnight. So all of that decision-making process, some people don't like it. Again, close living quarters. If you live in a subdivision or you just live on a street in an individual house, your neighbors aren't that close, but when you're living in a cooperative, it's a different story. And the organizational process of a housing co-op, it's complex. It takes a lot of work. It takes working with accountants and attorneys and developers and a whole bunch of people to pull it off, but it's worth it in the end. And then, all right, let's get there. I didn't say, but cooperative living, it's not for everybody. It's not the answer for everybody sitting in this room. So it would be kind of foolish for us to think, oh, well, this is the silver bullet or the panacea that's going to solve all our housing issues. It's not, because it doesn't work for everyone. But we do know that the co-op model, the housing co-op model, it's proven. There are housing cooperatives all over the world, all over this country. And as we saw, there are a bunch of different models that you can apply to your community, what works best in your community. And it can provide the answer to housing issues, not only in urban spaces, but in rural spaces. Obviously, in rural spaces, they're going to be smaller complexes, but it works just as well in a rural community as it does in an urban space. So, questions?
None of the houses are just houses, they're all multi-units? For some reason I thought it could be just houses.
They can.
Oh, okay.
They can.
You said sole ownership, they meant
Yep.
Okay, gotcha.
There are, the South Bend project is the scattered site, so
Scattered
each
sites, okay.
individual house is by itself, but the predominant model is going to be multifamily. whether it's a condo style or a rental type of affordable housing situation. Yes, ma'am.
Once you are in a co-op space, do you have the option to opt out is what I wanted to say.
Leave.
Opt out of being a part of the decision making, or is it according to the bylaws of how the design of the co-op is that everybody has to make a decision no matter what?
Usually the bylaws will have, so a quorum will be X percentage. So if there's an issue that has to come before the membership, a lot of times it'll be like 2/3 majority for a vote. If you live in a housing cooperative and you don't really want to be part of the board, you don't have to ever run for the board. If you don't want to be on committees, you don't have to do that. But when there are decisions that come before the membership, then the expectation is that you will vote on those issues that come before the entire membership. But other than that, you don't have to participate if you don't want to.
You just have to live with the 2/3 vote.
Yes. It's
Or
just,
with the choice
yeah.
of the 2/3.
It's just like here, if we don't vote, then we really don't have the right to complain about who got in office. If you vote, then you can say something, right? You can disagree with the decision, you can make your point, your viewpoint made. So there's no obligation to be involved, but the more you're involved, the more you're going to get out of living in that type of environment. But like I said, it is not for everybody. I'm not sure I could do it, but
I know it probably depends on the model, but typically who's responsible for making the decision of who's allowed into a co-op?
so there are applications. There's an application process. So there's policies around that, and I'm.
Is it a board decision or
Yes, I would say there's a board decision.
depending on the bylaw?
Yeah. And usually those policies are in a policy manual as opposed to part of the bylaws because of the requirement to change the bylaws. Having such a high bar, you have to have, that high percentage of people. So policies like that you want to put over here where it's easier to change, like the board can make those changes without going to the full membership. But there's an application process and a whole process for reviewing applications. And depending on the type of housing cooperative it is, maybe it's a senior housing cooperative, there are additional requirements in order to live in that housing complex, housing co-op. Yeah.
Is there a database of cooperative housings in Indiana or anything like that? Like how could you, if I was like thinking about moving somewhere, how could I figure out if there's co-op housing?
So there is a National Association of Housing Cooperatives, and I believe if it's NAHC.org, I believe they have a locator. I could be wrong. In the state of Indiana, there's one management company that manages a lot of the housing cooperatives, Kirkpatrick Management in Indianapolis. So they would have a list, and I'm working.
They manage the one here.
Oh, do they?
Yeah, I was looking at the one the co-op that's here, and
That's who their management company is?
property management.
Yeah.
Where's that located?
That's Green Square Apartments in Yorktown, right along 32.
Okay.
And yeah, I mean, like you were talking, like their units are like pretty cheap comparatively to the market, current market, especially. And I had like one of my employees moved in there not too long ago, and they really liked it. And, I told them about it, but I didn't even understand at the time that it was a co-op. What that really meant. So.
I have part of my work plan for next year is to work with the professor at IU to do a census of cooperatives in Indiana across all industries, because we don't have that. And you don't have to have the word cooperative in your name to organize as a co-op. And sometimes it's difficult. You could organize as an LLC and operate as a co-op. So getting to who's truly a co-op is difficult at best. So I'm hoping that the students in that class will kind of help us get a good idea of how many co-ops are out there and in what industries, and looking at what's the economic impact of those cooperatives on the state's economy.
Are they, when they organize typically as nonprofits, is that a 501c3 status or is it a different designation?
Yeah, I believe it's a C3.
Yeah.
Did you have a question?
No, I was saying while you were talking, I was looking up,
Oh,
through just a Google search. I looked up the ones in Indiana. I also, my dad's from Rockland, Maine, so I was interested in that particular one. And it said that in 2016, I think it was the 8th co-op in Maine at that point with the trailer parks. So, I mean, you can Google and find a lot of information just from a simple search.
yeah. They're out there. We just don't have an easy way to get to them, you know, a full list. But hopefully that will change. Any other questions?
And then your organization, ICDC, you're involved in other co-op models besides just housing.
Yes.
It could be businesses and so forth and all that.
Yep, ag, food co-ops, childcare, and if you, we did a series of webinars, childcare webinars that are on YouTube. So if you go to YouTube, look up ICDC, you can find those if you're interested in childcare issues. And one other quick thing, and I'll shut up. We did a housing summit this spring in March, and we want to continue the momentum. So we're going to do a series of lunch and learns starting in September. So September, October, November, January, February, culminating with another summit in March. So once I get those dates and get those nailed down, I'll get them to Nate to get out to everybody. So if you're interested, they'll be via Zoom. They'll be, you know, virtual, so be easy to participate.
I have one last question.
Sure.
So for these co-ops, it seems like it takes a lot of initial investment to start a co-op, to get the land, build the houses, and get it sustainable. You mentioned tax credits as a way one person did. What is the typical pathway for a co-op to start and get something going? Because I imagine it's not coming from people within it, because they have the means, they kind of want to be in the co-op.
So my experience in starting co-ops is limited, right? But in Minnesota, in working with the folks up there, their senior housing, those were started by developers. Okay, so they start the co-op. At some point, then they start the whole membership recruitment process, which is not part of what the developer does, but that's somebody like myself would help do that. And then when occupancy is at a certain point, then that developer turns over the project to the members. So funding for that can come through, there's a national bank called National Cooperative Bank that does a lot of housing financing. There's a couple of national certified development financial institutions, CDFIs. There's one in Boston called LEAF. There's one in Minnesota that's called Shared Capital Cooperative. There is some funding through the feds, through HUD. I don't know enough about that stream to be able to tell you, but HUD, if you would to call probably the Chicago office, the regional office, to see what programs they still have that have money in them. They may be on the books, but maybe they're not funded. And then traditional bank financing. But if you go to one of these sources who already do cooperative lending, it's a little easier because they already understand the financing structure. Whereas if you went to your local bank, they may not understand. Makes it a little more difficult.
I think one thing that I didn't hear you speak on, excuse me, is the number of individuals that can begin
for a housing co-op?
For any of those. I was going over the list that you had shared. The only thing that I didn't see was a medical component.
Those are much more difficult because of the laws. But there are a couple of, in the medical field, again, in Minnesota. And there was a project started in Ohio. I don't know if they're still operational. It depends on the type of co-op, and it depends on the state, because every state's co-op laws are different. Wouldn't it be so nice if there was just one set of laws? But there's not. In Indiana, if you want to start an ag co-op, you have to have 5 farmers to start. Most any other cooperative, there's not a minimum number, but the whole point is that it's people coming together. So you're going to want more than just one person. One person starts, that's the spark, and then starts talking to people they know, community members, people who have similar issues, and then that becomes the nucleus for starting the cooperative. Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if these are legitimate co-ops or not, but I know there's a large network of homeschool co-ops in our community and in neighboring areas. I hadn't heard that mentioned either, but you know, I've come across them. They call themselves co-ops, but whether or not it's technically registered as a co-op, I don't know.
And they don't have to be.
Right.
There was a law passed in 2017 in Indiana that if you use the word co-op or cooperative in your name, then you had to prove that you were a co-op. And the Department of Ag reviewed your application to the Secretary of State to make sure that your bylaws and all that said that you were a co-op. I don't think they look at it real closely, but you're supposed to truly be a co-op in order to use that word in your name.
And I know there's been an issue with the Hades word homeschool either. They haven't called it home educated. It's all this silly verbiage stuff. Yeah.
And there are childcare co-ops. There are some preschool cooperatives. They mostly are in the Marion County, Indianapolis area. They could be anywhere, but there is an association in Indiana of those as well. It's not at all unusual to have educational cooperatives.
I do have a question on childcare. If all the childcare groups in Delaware County, could they all become a co-op? And then basically every child could go to any one, and the price would all be the same? I mean, could that be a co-op or no?
It could be. Here's the unique thing about co-ops.
And then the teachers and everybody gets paid the same all the way around?
If you've seen one co-op, you've seen one co-op. So they're not necessarily organized the same. So that's possible if the child care providers wanted to come together and create a cooperative so that all of the staff became, employees of the co-op. The alternative to that would be, instead of them all coming together under one co-op, they could create like a shared services co-op. So that's kind of the back office stuff. So they create a co-op where they purchase supplies, or they purchase training for their instructors, or maybe it's, if they have a building and a facility, maybe it's lawn care. So it's or accounting services. So all of those kind of the back office logistical kinds of things, they could create a co-op.
Buying the supplies, it sounds like maybe Muncie Schools does that with some others.
And they do.
Districts or
It's
whatever.
not a formal cooperative, but they cooperate to get that group purchasing. Any other questions?
Thank you, Deb.
Sure, feel free to reach out if you have questions. Happy to answer them.
Thank you all for coming. If you want any more food, there's lots. You're welcome to take whatever you want. But I would just say again, the idea of bringing Deb today is just to kind of plant a seed. Maybe some of you have more knowledge about the co-ops, maybe less. One of the things that I really appreciate about the ICDC is that, as kind of Michael brought up the issue of like financing, Indiana, in a lot of ways, doesn't have the support structure for cooperatives to easily kind of flourish. So that's like the long game.
Yeah.
There's a famous example of cooperatives flourishing in all kinds of sectors in a place in Spain. It's called Mondragon.
Yes.
And it was after they had a dictator come in through war. It was the place was destroyed, and so there was this need to think about economic growth, health in a different way. And so they started working together, and it was much more about. It was more of a values project than it was an economic project. It was about like getting people to work together again after having so much war and things tear people apart. And out of that has birthed these incredible industries. They're still co-op run today.
Yeah.
And they have not only industries, but they have cooperative banks, they have co-op
Universities.
health plans, they have co-op universities. And I know that's like, a pipe dream in some ways, but when I think about Muncie, I think about what Muncie is. We're a town that grew up through industry. And then for the last 25, 30 years, we've been trying to get our footing again of like saying, what are we today? And so, a lot of people, which is part of the equation, are thinking about what can we bring in from the outside to get us over the hump. And I think sometimes when I think about the working class culture of Muncie, all these folks that worked in factories and have all these skills, and there's not places for them to apply those. I always think about if you could get folks with all these skills to work together and think about not working for the man, but actually working for themselves. That's a resource in Muncie that I think is undertapped. All that blue collar, really high level skill. And so I think I dream about sometimes that connection with what would it be like to have a movement of worker-owned co-ops, of people that live in some type of development and own it, and that means they're making decisions about it. Like as Deb said, they're not just learning to respond to other people making decisions; they learn to make decisions, and it's kind of a long-term like growth in skills, ability, knowledge that sometimes I feel like culturally we're not tapping into. So anyways, thank you for coming. Hope you come again next time. And thank you, Deb, for sharing some of your experience and knowledge with